Welcome, fellow night owl, to tonight's tranquil journey through the annals of history. As you settle in for a restful night's sleep, I invite you to join me on a voyage back to a time long past, an age of chivalry and castles, of kings and queens ruling vast realms from atop bejeweled thrones. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, and what time of day it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a delight to see the diversity of this sleepy, history-loving community. And if you enjoy these relaxing forays into yesteryear, consider subscribing so you never have trouble sleeping or relaxing again. Now, make yourself comfortable, dear friend. Perhaps you're nestled beneath soft sheets or curled up on a cozy sofa. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breath slows, let my words carry you gently back through the centuries to an era both familiar and strange, where we'll peek behind the stone walls of great castles and into the lives of those who once dwelled within. Tonight, we travel to medieval Europe, spanning from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the Renaissance blossoming of the 15th century. It was a time of faith and superstition, of plagues and progress, of conquests and crusades. Looming large over this ever-shifting landscape were the monarchs, those princes and princesses, kings and queens who claimed divine right to rule by the grace of God. From bejeweled crowns to ermine-trimmed cloaks, the royal regalia of the Middle Ages still captures our modern imaginations. When we picture the rulers of old, it's all too easy to envision them in a haze of unimaginable opulence, forever feasting and dancing, hunting and hawking, waging war and welcoming peace, draped in silks and dripping in jewels. But what was life really like for the royals of medieval Europe? How did they while away their days within the walls of sprawling castles and fortified manors? When they laid their crowned heads down to rest each night, what dreams and nightmares flickered behind their noble brows? As your own head sinks heavily into your pillow, I invite you to put yourself in their embroidered slippers for a spell. Imagine that you're a king or queen in the Middle Ages, born to a life of unimaginable privilege and power, but also one bound by duty, expectation, and tradition. Each choice you make will shape not just your own destiny, but the fate of kingdoms. So join me now, dear listener, as we tiptoe through echoing throne rooms and down torchlit passageways, our footfalls softened by thick rushes strewn across cold stone. We'll eavesdrop on councils and ceremonies, feasts and festivals, births and betrothals. In the process, we may just discover that the royals of old were more human than the dusty pages of history might suggest. Our first stop will be the royal bedchamber itself, that most private of sanctums where monarchs began and ended each day. As you nestle deeper into your own downy cocoon, let us draw back the heavy velvet drapes and greet the dawn as they might have many centuries ago. Imagine, if you will, the first rays of sunlight creeping through an arrow-slit window, glinting off the gold threads of a finely wrought tapestry. A gently smouldering hearth lends the chamber a drowsy warmth, its flickering light dancing across the intricate carvings of a massive oak bed, piled high with embroidered pillows and luxuriant furs. All is still, save for the measured breathing of the noble sleepers within. Before long, a gentle rapping at the door rouses the royal pair. It's the groom of the stool, that most intimate of courtiers, arriving to help the king with his morning ablutions. Yes, you heard that right. This highly coveted position involved assisting the king with, well, his morning routine, ensuring he was properly relieved and presentable for the day's arduous tasks. With great ceremony, the monarch is washed, dried, and dressed, layer upon sumptuous layer. The queen is tended to by her ladies-in-waiting, each one a high-born beauty, vying for her favour. Devotions come next, as the king and queen are expected to set a pious example for their subjects. In a small private chapel, they kneel side by side to recite the morning offices, the Latin phrases well worn upon their tongues. The haze of incense and the glimmer of chalices induce an almost dream-like state, a reminder that the right to rule is a divine mandate, and even the mightiest must humble themselves before God. But for all the ceremony, pomp, and prayer, medieval monarchs also had more worldly matters to attend to. And so, fortified by their faith, and perhaps a hearty breakfast of roasted boar, the king and queen emerged to face a day packed with courtly duties and obligations. As we've seen, despite their immense power and privilege, medieval monarchs were still very much human, with all the follies, fears, and foibles that entails. Their lives were defined as much by weighty duties as frivolous entertainments, as much by piety as politics. And perhaps no ruler better embodied these contradictions than the 12th century Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122 to one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in France, the young Eleanor was the heiress to a vast domain that comprised nearly a third of the country. Beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, she was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in Europe. In 1137, at the tender age of 15, she wed the 17-year-old Prince Louis, heir to the French throne. It was a prestigious match, but not a happy one. The scholarly, pious Louis was ill-suited to the vivacious and worldly Eleanor. Nevertheless, when Louis's father died later that year, the teenage couple became King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of France. Despite their differences, Eleanor joined Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, leading a contingent of her own Aquitanian soldiers. This headstrong act was rather scandalous at the time. Crusading was thought to be the domain of men, not ladies. But Eleanor was no ordinary lady. Dressed in armour and mounted on a white horse, she cut a striking figure on the march to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, like most crusades, it ended in a disappointment. The Christian armies failed to retake Jerusalem and returned home in defeat. The crusade only widened the rift between Eleanor and Louis. They had never been close, but now they could barely stand each other. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, the mismatched couple sought an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, being related by blood, a big taboo for the church. In reality, it was a thin excuse to get out of an unhappy marriage. The Pope granted the annulment in 1152, and at the age of 30, Eleanor found herself single and ready to mingle. She didn't stay single for long, though. Just 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor married the strapping young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, an 18-year-old fellow by the name of Henry Plantagenet. It was a whirlwind romance and a savvy political move. Through their union, Eleanor's lands were joined with Henry's, creating a powerful counterweight to the French crown. But that was just the beginning. When Henry's cousin, King Stephen of England, died in 1154, Henry pressed his claim to the English throne, and became King Henry II, with Eleanor as his queen. At a stroke, the couple now ruled a vast empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the so-called Angevin Empire. Over the next 13 years, the fertile Eleanor would bear Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland of Magna Carta fame. However, all was not wedded bliss for the royal couple. Like Eleanor's first marriage, her second union was marked by conflict and strife. Henry was a serial philanderer, openly taking mistresses and siring illegitimate children. He was also a domineering and often cruel husband, restricting Eleanor's movements and limiting her authority. The fiercely independent Eleanor chafed at such treatment, and the marriage deteriorated into a cold war. Things came to a head in 1173 when Eleanor's sons, prodded by their mother, rebelled against Henry in a bid for power. It was the ultimate dynastic betrayal, but the revolt sputtered out, and Henry took his revenge. He captured Eleanor and imprisoned her for the next 16 years, locking her away in various royal castles. Her sons fared little better. Henry's namesake, the young king, died of dysentery while leading a rebellion in 1883. Geoffrey perished in a jousting tournament in 1886. But time and tide wait for no man, not even kings. When Henry himself died in 1189, Eleanor's favourite son, Richard, ascended to the throne, and one of his first acts was to free his long-suffering mother. At the ripe old age of 67, Eleanor rode out of captivity and returned to the seat of power. With Richard often absent on crusade, Eleanor served as regent for her son, skillfully managing the realm and his ransom when he was briefly held hostage. Even in her twilight years, the indomitable Eleanor remained a force to be reckoned with. When Richard died in 1199, she supported her youngest son, John's claim to the crown over his nephew Arthur. At the age of 77, she personally led an army to lay siege to Arthur's supporters, securing the succession for John. She died in 1204 at the monastery of Fontevraud at the astounding age of 82, an incredible lifespan for that time. In many ways, Eleanor of Aquitaine both reflected and defied the norms for medieval queens. She wielded immense power and wealth, shaping the politics of her age through her marriages and machinations. But she also endured great hardships, from an abusive husband to a 16-year imprisonment. She was a woman who broke the mold, who refused to be constrained by the expectations of her gender or station. A trendsetter and a trailblazer, a crusader and a queen, a mother and a monarch. Eleanor's extraordinary life reads like something out of an epic novel. Yet her story is no fiction, but rather a testament to the complex realities of life for medieval royalty. The power and the privilege, the duty and the domesticity, the piety and the politics, all were part and parcel of the royal experience. Eleanor embodied these contradictions, perhaps more than any other, navigating them with savvy and tenacity. Her legacy continues to loom large, captivating the imagination of historians and novelists alike. As we explore the lives of other notable rulers like Eleanor, a rich tapestry of medieval monarchy emerges, a world of decadent feasts and pious fasts, of grand castles and grander cathedrals, of arranged marriages and courtly love affairs, a world where reputation was everything and dynasty was destiny, where the crown was both a blessing and a burden. In short, a world at once strangely alien and strikingly familiar. Perhaps that is why peering into the private lives of medieval kings and queens continues to fascinate us. It offers a window into a lost world, a glimpse of humanity beneath the crowns and coronets. In their triumphs and tribulations, their vices and virtues, we see reflections of ourselves across the ages. And in that sense, their stories become our stories. Their history becomes our heritage. So, as we conclude our journey through the rarefied realm of medieval royalty, let us take a moment to ponder the lessons their lives can teach us. The perils of power, the burdens of privilege, the weight of expectation, but also the enduring human capacity for resilience, for reinvention, for leaving a mark on history. For in the end, though they may have worn crowns and sat on thrones, they were still flesh and blood, still fallible and mortal, just like you and me. And on that note, dear listener, it is time for us to bid farewell to the gilded courts and candle-lit halls of ages past. May your dreams be filled with visions of mighty castles and fair maidens, of brave knights and wise kings. And may you awake refreshed, with a newfound appreciation for the royalty of old, and the humanity in us all. With the founding of the Order of the Garter, Edward III set a new standard for the pageantry and chivalric ideals that would come to define royal life in the late Middle Ages. This prestigious order of knighthood, with its elaborate ceremonies, grand feasts, and distinctive emblem of a blue garter, epitomized the pomp and majesty that medieval monarchs sought to cultivate. As we've seen, Edward and his queen, Philippa, presided over a splendid court culture at Windsor Castle, surrounding themselves with the greatest artists, poets, and musicians of the age. But amidst all the grandeur and revelry, medieval rulers were also expected to embody a deep and abiding piety. Religion suffused every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, and this was especially true for monarchs, who ruled by divine right. A king or queen was seen as God's anointed representative on earth, entrusted with leading their people not only in matters of state, but in spiritual affairs as well. As such, medieval royalty were held to the highest standards of moral rectitude and religious devotion. A typical day for a medieval monarch would begin with morning mass in their lavish private chapel, attended by a retinue of priests and clerics. Kings and queens would spend long hours in prayer, offering supplications for the well-being of their realm and the salvation of their immortal soul. The Book of Hours, a richly illuminated devotional text, was a prized possession of many royals, who would pore over its gilded pages in quiet contemplation. The religious calendar also dictated much of the rhythm of courtly life. The liturgical year was punctuated by a series of holy feasts and fasts that all members of the royal household were expected to observe. Lent, in particular, saw the royal diet restricted to very simple, meatless meals in emulation of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. But it was during the great celebrations of Christmas and Easter that the piety and majesty of medieval monarchy reached its fullest flower. The king or queen would preside over magnificent ceremonies in the great cathedrals, wearing their finest regalia and crowns. Amid clouds of incense and the chant of masked choirs, they would take communion before their assembled subjects, affirming their role as the ultimate spiritual authority in the land. This public display of piety was immensely important for cultivating the aura of sanctity and righteousness that medieval rulers depended on to legitimate their earthly power. By publicly venerating saintly relics, endowing monasteries and churches, and even embarking on holy pilgrimages and crusades, kings and queens sought to reinforce their image as the godly stewards of Christian society. Perhaps no one embodied this ideal of the pious medieval monarch more fully than Louis IX of France, known to history as Saint Louis. Renowned for his devout faith and austere lifestyle, Louis was a king who fasted regularly, wore a hair shirt under his royal robes as a sign of penance, and even invited the poor to eat at his table. He embarked on 2 ultimately disastrous crusades to the Holy Land, dying of dysentery on the second venture in Tunisia. But his reputation for saintliness only grew, and he was canonized by the Catholic Church just 27 years after his death. Of course, not all medieval rulers lived up to such lofty ideals. For every St. Louis, there was a king like Henry VIII of England, who famously broke with the Catholic Church in order to divorce his first wife, and went on to marry 5 more times. The notorious Pope Alexander VI, who reigned during the Renaissance, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children and was accused of turning the Vatican into a den of depravity. But for most medieval monarchs, piety and prayer remained an essential part of their daily lives and public personas. In an age when the line between the sacred and the secular was thin indeed, kings and queens were expected to bridge that divide, serving as both the temporal and spiritual leaders of their people. It was a weighty responsibility, and one that could take a toll even on the most devout of rulers. The great Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne, who ruled much of Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, was said to have wept with emotion as he took communion on his deathbed. So acutely did he feel the burden of his sins and the immensity of his role as God's vice-regent on earth. For the medieval monarchs who bore this sacred mantle, the glittering trappings of royal life, the sumptuous banquets, the silk-draped beds, the fawning courtiers, were perhaps a welcome distraction from the weighty matters of the soul that occupied so many of their waking hours. In the flickering candlelight of the royal chapel, as the king or queen knelt in prayer before the altar, the outside world, with its earthly cares and pleasures, must have seemed far away indeed. As we contemplate these long-ago rulers in their private moments of piety, we are reminded of the deeply human dimension of even the most exalted lives. Behind the crowns and sceptres, the ermine-trimmed robes, and the soaring rhetoric, medieval monarchs grappled with the same eternal questions that have always haunted the human heart. Questions of meaning, mortality, and the yearning for connection with the divine. In the tomb-like hush of the great cathedrals where they worshipped, or in the flickering shadows of their own bedchamber, these kings and queens sought solace and guidance from a higher power. And in so doing, they left us a powerful reminder of the enduring search for purpose and transcendence that unites us all across the ages. But even the most pious of rulers could not spend all their days in prayer and contemplation. The business of actually ruling a kingdom called, and medieval monarchs had to navigate a treacherous landscape of competing interests, shifting alliances, and powerful personalities as they sought to maintain their grip on power. Perhaps no one exemplified the shrewd political maneuvering and force of character required of a successful medieval ruler quite like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into a wealthy noble family in southwestern France in 1122, Eleanor was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in Europe when she inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in her own right at the tender age of 15. Her first marriage to pious King Louis VII of France was, by all accounts, a mismatch of personalities. The worldly and cultured Eleanor found the ascetic Louis unbearably dull, and their relationship soured after she accompanied him on the ill-fated Second Crusade to the Holy Land. The expedition was a disaster, and rumours swirled that Eleanor had carried on an affair with her uncle, the dashing Raymond of Poitiers, while encamped in the shadow of the great walls of Antioch. When the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was effectively over, and in a shocking move for the time, the Pope granted Louis an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related. Eleanor, still only 28 years old, suddenly found herself once again the most desirable bride in Christendom. Her next match would prove far more consequential. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor married the young Duke of Normandy, who also held vast territories in western France. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and 2 years later he would ascend to the throne of England as King Henry II, with Eleanor as his queen. Together, Eleanor and Henry would preside over a sprawling empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England and more than half of modern-day France. It was one of the largest and most powerful realms in medieval Europe, and at its centre stood the formidable partnership of Henry and Eleanor. Over the course of their tempestuous 35-year marriage, the royal couple would have 8 children together, including 2 future kings of England, the legendary Richard the Lionheart and his treacherous brother John. Eleanor would serve as regent for her sons when they took the throne, wielding immense power and influence in her own right. But her path to becoming one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe was hardly a smooth one. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was notoriously fractious, marked by infidelities, power struggles, and outright rebellion on the part of their sons, often with Eleanor's backing. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 eldest sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose up against their father in a bid for greater autonomy and control over their own territories. Eleanor, who had long chafed under Henry's efforts to curtail her authority, sided with her sons in the revolt. But the rebellion was ultimately crushed, and Eleanor was captured while attempting to flee to France. An enraged Henry imprisoned her, keeping his queen under house arrest for the next 16 years. It was only after Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her son Richard, now King of England. Despite being nearly 70 years old, she lost no time in reasserting her political influence. When Richard set off on the Third Crusade shortly after his coronation, Eleanor served as regent in his absence, governing England with a firm hand. She would go on to outlive both Richard and his successor, John, dying in 1204 at the remarkable age of 82. Eleanor's long and tumultuous life offers a fascinating glimpse into the complex realities of power and gender in the medieval world. As a woman who wielded immense influence in her own right, as a wealthy heiress, queen consort, regent, and mother of kings, Eleanor defied many of the constraints placed on her sex in an intensely patriarchal society. But her story also underscores the precariousness of even the most exalted woman's position in medieval society. For all her wealth and influence, Eleanor was still ultimately subject to the will of the men around her. First her husbands, then her sons. Her imprisonment at Henry's hands serves as a stark reminder of the limits of female power, in a world where kings still ruled supreme. And yet, Eleanor's enduring fascination for historians and storytellers alike suggests that her legacy transcends the simple trappings of royalty or the constraints of her gender. In many ways, she embodies the restless, questing spirit of an age, a time when the old feudal order was giving way to a new world of courtly romance, chivalric ideals, and the first stirrings of individualism. As a patron of the arts and a leader of the courts of love, grand assemblies where the conventions of courtly romance were celebrated and codified, Eleanor helped to shape the cultural ideals that would define the High Middle Ages. Her influence can be seen in everything from the love poetry of the troubadours to the soaring cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts that still take our breath away today. In Eleanor's story, we see a woman who grappled with the great questions of her age, questions of power, faith, love, and duty, and who left an indelible mark on the world she inhabited. Hers is a tale of ambition and intrigue, of passion and politics, of the struggle to assert oneself in a world that was not always kind to strong-willed women. But it is also, in the end, a deeply human story, a reminder that even the most towering figures of history were flesh and blood people, with all the flaws and foibles that entails. In the flickering candlelight of a long-ago castle chamber, we can imagine Eleanor as she might have been in a rare moment of repose, a woman of indomitable spirit and fierce intelligence, yet still subject to the same yearnings and vulnerabilities that have always animated the human heart. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of Eleanor and her world, a world of crenellated battlements and fluttering banners, of soaring cathedrals and scented gardens, of love and war and the eternal dance of power. And let us remember, too, that the great sweep of history is ultimately woven from the countless strands of individual lives, each one a story waiting to be told, a legacy waiting to be remembered in the stillness of the night. As we've seen, the lives of medieval monarchs were steeped in extravagance and pageantry, yet also heavily circumscribed by rigid expectations and weighty responsibilities. For all the grandeur of their castles and courts, kings and queens faced a daily existence that was, in many ways, far from enviable. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance. Born into wealth and privilege as the heiress to a vast duchy, she became Queen of France at the tender age of 15, upon her marriage to King Louis VII. The young couple embarked on the ill-fated Second Crusade together, a grueling journey across thousands of miles that ended in military failure and personal estrangement. After 15 years of marriage and the birth of 2 daughters, Eleanor and Louis's union was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. But Eleanor's story was far from over. Just 8 weeks later, she married the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who shortly thereafter ascended the throne as King Henry II of England. As queen once again, Eleanor proved a formidable political presence, governing England as regent during Henry's long absences and bearing him 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Yet, for all her power and influence, Eleanor's life was tumultuous and constricted by the politics of the day. Her marriage to Henry grew increasingly fractious, and she eventually incited her sons to rebel against their father, a transgression for which she spent 16 years under house arrest. In the end, she outlived both her husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children, dying at the ripe old age of 82 as the Queen Mother and one of the great survivors of the age. Eleanor's remarkable tale highlights the precarious position in which even the most blue-blooded of medieval women found themselves. Subject to the authority of fathers, husbands, and sons, queens could wield significant influence from behind the scenes, but always at the risk of censure or punishment for overstepping their bounds. The personal was deeply political, and a royal woman's choice of spouse or ability to produce heirs could spell the difference between dynastic glory and ruin. This was certainly the case for Empress Matilda, the daughter of England's King Henry I. Groomed for greatness from a young age, Matilda was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor as a teenager, and later recalled to England to be named her father's heir after the death of her brother in a shipwreck. But the barons balked at accepting a woman as their ruler. And when Henry died, Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, rushed to seize the throne, plunging England into a nearly 20-year civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda fought fiercely for what she saw as her birthright, rallying troops to her cause, and even escaping a castle under siege by being lowered down the walls in a coffin. She came tantalizingly close to the crown, entering London in triumph and preparing for her coronation. But the fickle citizens soon turned on her, and she was chased out of the city, never to return. In the end, Matilda was forced to settle for seeing her son, the future Henry II, recognized as Stephen's successor, a diplomatic resolution to England's turmoil, but a personally disappointing outcome for a woman who had fought so long and hard to be queen in her own right. The stories of Eleanor and Matilda offer a poignant reminder of the limitations medieval women faced, even at the very apex of society. Queens and empresses might accrue fabulous wealth and wield considerable influence, but their agency was always contingent on the forbearance of the men around them. First their husbands, then their sons. In a world where martial prowess was the ultimate source of authority, female rulers were only ever regents or intercessors, never truly secure on their thrones. Yet, if the political sphere was largely closed off to them, medieval royal women could and did find other outlets for their ambitions. Many carved out significant roles for themselves as patrons of the arts, commissioning magnificent works of art and architecture to adorn their palaces and glorify their memories. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a noted sponsor of troubadours and poets, presiding over a glittering court culture that helped define the early medieval vogue for courtly love. Other queens took a more active role in the religious life of their realms, founding abbeys and monasteries, going on pilgrimages, and even leading crusades, as Eleanor did alongside her first husband. The church offered a rare space where royal women could exercise a degree of autonomy and spiritual authority, even as it relegated them to a subordinate position in the social order. Of course, not all medieval monarchs were as outsized characters as Eleanor or Matilda. For every ruler who left an indelible mark on the historical record, there were scores more who lived and died in relative obscurity, their names recorded only in dry chronicles and faded pedigrees. These forgotten sovereigns may not have shifted the course of nations, but their experiences too are crucial for understanding what life was like for royalty in an age far removed from our own. Consider, for instance, the daily routine of an average medieval king. Although we might think of royal schedules today as jam-packed with court ceremonials, diplomatic engagements, and affairs of state. The reality in medieval times was often considerably more slothful. While the typical day would open with Mass at dawn, and perhaps some dispensation of justice or audiences with courtiers, many monarchs spent long stretches in sybaritic ease, drifting from banquet to hunt to gaming table in a haze of idle pleasure-seeking. Writing in the 12th century, the chronicler Walter Map described a royal feast with more than a hint of moralistic judgment. In the midst of wanton joys and unbridled pleasures, with jesters and minstrels, dishes and delicacies fit for kings, dancers and jugglers, all shame was cast aside, all modesty abandoned, and day was turned into night by the torch's flare, and the air resounded with shouts and acclamations. Behind the bluster, one can detect a very human vulnerability. For all their license to indulge in feasts and frivolities, medieval monarchs were expected to live up to nearly impossible ideals of nobility, piety, and honour. They were supposed to be generous patrons, fierce warriors, wise judges, and unimpeachable moral examples, all while navigating the treacherous currents of court politics and dynastic rivalry. It's little wonder that so many sought refuge in life's fleeting pleasures, or clung to the comforts of religion. At the end of the day, perhaps that is what is most striking about the medieval monarchical experience. Not its distance from our own, but its fundamental humanity. Peeling back the ermine robes and shining crowns, one finds people not so different from ourselves. Individuals struggling to reconcile duty and desire, to make their mark on the world while playing the hands they were dealt by fate and circumstance. In a society as rigidly hierarchical as medieval Europe, it could be tempting to see royalty as superhuman paragons, blessed by birthright to glide far above the common run of cares and woe. But examine their lives more closely, and a different picture emerges, one of real men and women shouldering heavy burdens and harbouring quiet dreams, much like any of us today. So when next you settle down for the night and close your heavy eyes, spare a thought for those long ago kings and queens whose stories have drifted down to us through the ages. Imagine yourself behind the high stone walls of a draughty castle bedchamber, feeling the weight of the crown as your head sinks into the pillow. Dream yourself into their world of ceremony and intrigue, languor and longing. And ponder for a moment how much has changed, and how much remains the same. Until next time, I bid thee good night and sweet dreams.